this joint statement between the European Union and China that they intend not only to keep up their commitments to the Paris deal, but actually to accelerate their cooperation. So really what you're going to see is a pivot away from the United States by Europe, away from what has been a historic and essential ally to other potential allies as European leaders look ahead, not just to the global challenge that is posed by climate change, but to many of the other global challenges going ahead. Christine.
All right, Melissa Belforis in Paris this morning. Above the Champs-Elysees, nice to see you. Thank you.
China this morning reaffirming its commitment to fight climate change, promising to be a, quote, responsible party after the U.S. bailed. One European leader warning that if America steps off the world stage, the Chinese are in prime position to fill the vacuum. Let's bring in CNN's Matt Rivers for more on Chinese plans. He's live in Beijing. So what are the plans?
Well, the plans are to kind of be the de facto leader of the Paris Climate Agreement now. And why is that? Whether the Chinese want that or not, China is the biggest greenhouse gas emitting country in the world, and they are the largest economy that remains in the Paris Agreement. And so whether China likes it or not, other countries around the world are going to be looking at what the Chinese do when it comes to sticking to this agreement. How far are they willing to go to fight climate change? And other countries will be following China's example, because China, as the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, as the biggest economy that remains in the agreement, they have the biggest ability to create change when it comes to fighting climate change. And so far, it does appear that the Chinese are willing to do quite a bit. They have already said that they are going to commit $360 billion to develop clean energy projects over the next 3 or 4 years, and they've already shut down about 105 coal power plant projects scheduled to be built this year. So it does appear they're putting their money where their mouth is. As to commenting specifically on the United States, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did not criticize the U.S. specifically, saying only that China would remain in the agreement. But a state-run tabloid newspaper called the Global Times called the U.S. withdrawal reckless and said it is an example of how the U.S. can sometimes be selfish and irresponsible. Victor.
All right, Matt Rivers giving us the view there from Beijing. Thank you.
So these critics, you've been hearing them from around the world. They say America's influence on world events is now diminished, and America could find itself taking a back seat on other critical global issues. I want to go live to London right now and bring in CNN's Frederick Pleiken. And Fred, talk us through sort of the ramifications for other issues, trade issues, other diplomatic issues of importance because of the U.S. move on the Paris climate deal.
Yeah, trade issues, security issues, political issues, of course, as well. International alliances also. I think especially with the European allies, you're going to see many of them look to different partners for many things, especially when you're speaking about things like international trade, which, of course, also is kind of embedded into the whole climate change complex as well, because so much of it involves putting together new industries and new concepts as well to try and create infrastructure for the future. So there are a lot of European allies that are already doing that. And then all this, of course, bleeds into the political realm as well, Christine, where in the future, if you have a dispute between the U.S. and China, for instance, be it a trade dispute, a political dispute, a regional dispute, perhaps in the Pacific region, where, for instance, are the Europeans going to stand if they have deeper political and economic ties with a country like China, or it could be a country like India, or perhaps even Russia, if you're talking about European affairs. So certainly this does stand to have very big ramifications, and it's one of the things that European leaders have been saying. For instance, that of the European Commission, just coming out yesterday and saying he believes that China could fill a vacuum if indeed the U.S. did what it's now done and exit that climate deal.
Yeah, and China this morning actually vowing that it will be the responsible player on the global stage, clearly taking that public relations gift. Thank you so much for that, Fred Pleiken, for us this morning in London.
All right, so President Trump here explaining his decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord.
We don't want other leaders and other countries laughing at us anymore, and they won't be. They won't be.
Were other nations laughing?
Well, they don't agree with this president at all. Top CEOs expressing disappointment over the president's decision to withdraw. Big names like General Electric CEO Jeff Immelt, Apple's Tim Cook, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, Tesla founder Elon Musk, and the Disney chief Bob Iger. They went so far, they quit the president's business council. It even inspired Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein to send his first tweet ever. The guy doesn't tweet, but he did yesterday. He wrote the decision is a setback for both the environment and the U.S. leadership position in the world. Hundreds of companies in every industry support this deal. I mean, not just lefty tech, right? We're talking finance, consumer products, even oil companies. That's because corporate America says this president is looking backwards. Clean energy and tech is the future. Climate change, they say, is real, and they want to be leaders on adapting to it. They don't want to cede the competitive edge to China, Russia, or Europe. The president and the critics of the deal say this Paris deal was simply a jobs killer. But job growth in clean energy is actually outpacing any old-school energy sector. For example, last year, the solar industry grew 17 times faster than the average. Solar also employs more than twice as many Americans as coal. Trump, of course, would like to get that coal number up again. Climate change is a business risk, and companies already made plans based on lowering carbon emissions. Those CEOs are saying they're not going to change course now. Overall, frankly, business leaders are outraged. You will not find that outrage, though, in the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. This sort of standard bearer of the business view actually applauding the president's move, calling the Paris deal a pledge of phony progress.
All right, let's talk about this now. Joining us this morning, political economist Greg Valliere. He's chief strategist at Horizon Investments. Good morning to you.
Hi, Greg.
So you've got former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers calling this, and I wrote it down, biggest foreign policy error since entering the Iraq War. David Gergen calling it one of the most shameful acts in U.S. history. You say what?
Well, I think there's a lot of hyperventilating here over a deeply flawed treaty. I was particularly stunned to hear David Gergen say it was one of the most shameful acts in U.S. history. Really? Like compared to slavery or Japanese internment or treatment of Native Americans? So, I mean, the rhetoric has been pretty heated. But when you look at the treaty, it has tons of loopholes. It's not enforceable. The alleged progress would be minimal. So, I mean, I'm hardly a huge supporter of Trump, but I do think there's a lot of flaws in this treaty.
So, assuming there are flaws in this treaty, I mean, to get 195 countries to agree to any one thing, you can only imagine the kind of horse trading that went on.
Yep.
Let's talk about the symbolism here, though. When you have all of these world leaders from capitals around the world saying the president made the wrong move and he is distancing himself from this global community that has been the standard post-World War II,
right.
Doesn't that concern you about what this means for the U.S. role in other issues?
I think it's intentional, Christine. I think this
you might be right.
I think this administration and Steve Bannon want to isolate the U.S., fortress America. Let's disengage from all of these global conflicts, nation building, things like that. So I think it's a consequence of what happened, but I think it's an intended consequence.
Yeah, we're showing sort of who wanted to stay in and who wanted to leave the deal, and clearly, and we were told, Dana Bash's reporting was that this president was 10,000% sure that he needed to do this, that his base... His base are those coal miners, are those old, heavy industry neighborhoods. You know, he mentioned Pittsburgh. He said he wants to, you know, he's doing this for Pittsburgh, not for Paris.
Right.
And I was struck by that because in 2012, Pittsburgh hosted the G20, and it was held up as the model of the post-carbon economy. You know, steel cratered there, and now it is the center of the hub for technology for autonomous cars. It has a diverse base with niche manufacturing, but also with tech and startups. Using Pittsburgh, I found, was not the right example.
Fully agree. I mean, he has a view of Pittsburgh that's about 50 years old. But, you know, this dystopian view of things falling apart, that's all part of the Steve Bannon line. But let's get realistic here. If Trump runs again, and he may run again, he's got to put together the same electoral college map. So it's not a coincidence. He mentioned Youngstown, Pittsburgh. He has to win Ohio. He has to win Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. These are voters who feel ignored, blue-collar white voters who abandoned Hillary Clinton. That's who I think the message was intended for.
And you see here on the screen, this is a tweet from Bill Peduto, the mayor of Pittsburgh, who was on with Wolf Blitzer yesterday. He says here, Hillary Clinton received 80% of the vote in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh stands with the world and will follow Paris Agreement. Let me also go to this issue of playing to the president's base and this being a domestic message. The president has set up this dichotomy between jobs and the environment. But aren't those jobs, this green tech sector that is blossoming, those jobs now are vulnerable to be shipped off to Asia, to China, to India, namely?
Well, I think, Victor, that the two are not exclusive. You can have jobs and you can have environmental controls. And I think this is one of the many flaws in his talk. And there were many things in his talk, as usual, that were challenged by the facts. So you would have to say that this could be a problem. But there's nothing in what he said yesterday that would not preclude U.S. cities, U.S. states, U.S. companies from meeting emission standards, and I think they will.
Are you surprised Bob Iger? I sat down with Bob Iger just a week ago, actually. I asked him about his role in that advisory panel with the president. And he told me, Greg, he said, well, I haven't been to one of the meetings yet, which kind of raised my interest that he wasn't fully committed, really, to maybe Team Trump here. But he's quitting that advisory panel. What do you make of some of these high-profile moves from CEOs?
Well, a lot of it's about public relations. Do they really want to tell their customers they favor pulling out of the Paris Accords? It sounds like, killing the Easter Bunny or something. So nobody wants to nobody wants to fess up to that. But again, I would just reiterate, guys, if you look at this treaty, it is a really flawed treaty. And by the way, the full Senate would never approve this deal.
Oh, yeah, as it stands today, no, I don't think you would have it. It would not be ratified.
All right, Greg Valliere, we'll continue this conversation next.
Climate Accord.
The future of America's role shaping global issues suddenly in doubt. President Trump pulls out of a landmark climate accord. So is the U.S. abdicating leadership to some allies and some adversaries? Early Start coverage continues right now. Welcome back to Early Start. I'm Christine Romans.
I'm Victor Blackwell. 29 minutes till the top of the hour. This morning, the United States is no longer a global leader combating climate change. President Trump announcing he is withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accord, a process that will take until November 2020 to complete. Check your calendar. There's something else happening in November 2020. The sweeping move fulfills the campaign promise, but it's prompting sharp backlash from nations around the globe.
Speaking from the Rose Garden, the president said he wants to renegotiate key parts of this agreement, but there are stark warnings this morning that the U.S. is ceding a leadership role that has held shaping world events since World War II.
Well, the decision to withdraw being met with a stinging rebuke in Europe this morning. German Chancellor Angela Merkel calling President Trump's move regrettable. The president of the European Commission says there is no reverse gear on the Paris deal. CNN's Melissa Bell is in Paris for more on the response from key European allies. And that reference to a reverse gear comes after the president says not only is the U.S. withdrawing, but they'll attempt to renegotiate another global deal. That from Macron saying that that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen, and that reply was really united, coming really very quickly after Donald Trump had made that announcement from the Rose Garden. There simply is no possibility for any renegotiation of this deal. That's been part of the response. The other part, Victor, and this is perhaps the most interesting, has been the extent to which this has seemed to galvanize the rest of the world and to increase their determination really to move ahead and to move ahead faster. I was been speaking over the course of the last few hours to the woman who led France's negotiations 18 months ago, and she said she's very optimistic because what this has shown is how strongly the world feels about this deal. You know, you really have to cast your mind back 18 months ago when the whole world, 195 countries, gathered here to come up with this improbable deal. At the time, really, Victor, the question had been, is the world ready for Paris? 18 months on, and this is something that the united response is reminding of us of this morning. The question is really, how can the world live without Paris? And I think it is thanks to what Donald Trump had to announce yesterday in the Rose Garden that this has really been come as a reminder to many of the world. We're going to hear later, to many people around the world, we're going to hear later today from Brussels, where the United European Union and China will put out this united statement, this joint statement about the fact that they intend to work together and to work together more closely and quicker to achieve their targets. Victor.
All right, Melissa Bell for us there in Paris. Thank you.
All right, in Beijing, the Chinese government this morning reaffirming its commitment to fight climate change, promising to be a, quote, responsible party after the U.S. bailed. One European leader warning that if America steps off the world stage, the Chinese are in prime position to fill that vacuum. I want to bring in CNN's Matt Rivers for more on China's plans. He's live in Beijing. And, you know, just on any kind of given day, any video of a Chinese city and the pollution there shows you why already the Chinese are such leaders in clean technology. Their people are demanding it.
Yeah, they don't really have a choice, and it's a very easy sell domestically for the government here. Those of us who live in Beijing have to deal with horrific air quality on a regular basis. It's very much a social concern here, and the government recognizes that, and they see an opportunity twofold. On the one hand, they can satisfy a domestic need, and on the other hand, they can take what could be their first really truly global leadership role on an issue that affects all of these countries. Why can they take that leadership role? They are the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, and they are the largest economy remaining staying in this agreement. And so other countries are going to look at what the Chinese do when it comes to sticking with this agreement and when it comes with pushing the envelope. What are the Chinese willing to do to fight climate change? And what we've seen so far is some pretty interesting evidence. The Chinese have curbed their coal consumption 3 years running now, and they are set to invest $360 billion US by the year 2020 in clean energy development projects. There are some concerns that they're still relying too much on coal, but the fact is the Chinese appear to be putting their money where their mouth is. Now, in terms of responding to the U.S. leaving, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs didn't directly respond to that, saying only that China believes that all countries should remain in the agreement, and they will continue to do so. But a state-run tabloid newspaper called the Global Times said that the U.S. withdrawing from this agreement is reckless and an example of how the U.S. can be selfish when it comes to international agreements.
All right, Matt Rivers for us in Beijing this morning. Thank you.
Critics say that America's influence on world events will now be diminished, and America could find itself taking a backseat on other critical global issues. So let's go now live to London and bring in CNN's Frederick Pleitkin. Frederick, good morning to you, and I'd like to examine not just the U.S.'s role in many of these other global issues, but on an individual basis. President Trump, and you're there in London with, let's say, Theresa May, who's facing election soon, what this will mean not just for the larger agreements, but for the individual leaders who have stood close to President Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's going to have a big impact on them and the way that they move forward. And you're absolutely right. Theresa May, for instance, here in the United Kingdom, is currently in a re-election campaign. And right now, any support that she receives from President Trump, especially after that decision that he made yesterday, really probably isn't going to help her very much to get reelected. And the same thing is also true, by the way, in places like Germany as well, where the figure of President Trump and the fact that he is so anti, or was so anti this climate deal and has now made this decision is a big thing in an election campaign there as well. And all political parties are taking shots at the U.S. president and saying, look, this is something that can't continue. On the other hand, though, I have to say, one of the things that arguably all of this has been very good for has actually been cohesion in the European Union. The Europeans are talking more than I've heard them, at least in the past years, talking about needing to strengthen the European Union, needing to work together. So a lot of that is still happening. And then on a larger scale, of course, Victor, it's going on as well with, for instance, China. And right now, as we speak, there's actually an EU-China investment summit going on where the head of the European Union came out and said that he believed that China and the EU are aligned in the need for international solutions. So it really looks as though there is already that pivot going on in many nations, but on a larger scale as well.
As the president sets up this dichotomy between jobs here in the U.S. and the environment and repeating that America first mantra, we have to remember this does not happen in a vacuum. Frederick Pleitkin, there for us in London.
All right, 38 minutes past the hour, President Trump making this claim about the Paris Climate Accord.
Could cost America as much as 2.7 million lost jobs.
Is that claim true? And what kind of jobs is he talking about?
Could cost America as much as 2.7 million lost jobs by 2025.
That nugget from a favorite study of the deal's critics, commissioned by a conservative public interest group. Other experts say it grossly overestimates the cost of cutting emissions. It only counts losses in heavy industry like steel and coal, not gains in alternative energy. Job growth in clean energy outpacing any old school energy sector. Look at this. Last year, solar jobs grew 17 times faster than the average. Solar employs more than twice the number of Americans that coal does. So does natural gas. Experts say the president's policies could impede that job trend. It's why business leaders are calling out the president's decision. They say he is stuck in the past. The future of jobs and investment in clean technology. Joining us this morning, political economist Greg Valliere. He's chief strategist at Horizon Investments. Good morning, Greg.
Hi, Christine.
So many of these business leaders are saying the president is just flat wrong, but you know what? He's not talking to them. He's talking to his base here, isn't he? This is about telling his base, I'm going to do what I told you I was going to do, and then there's this secondary benefit of sort of pissing off global leaders.
Well, you're absolutely right, and let me give you my quick theory here as to why the timing came yesterday. 1 week from today, we'll all be talking about obstruction of justice because we get Comey testifying next Thursday. And I think a major reason why the Senate is not going to indict and the House is not going to convict, a major reason why impeachment is so unlikely, is that Trump's base is held in there. It's 2/3 of the Republican Party. They're not going to oust him. As long as Trump's base is loyal, he's safe. And that's why I think he made the speech yesterday.
So we heard from some people who are, I guess, overlapping into the president's base, namely Democrat Joe Manchin of West Virginia, conservative Democrat from West Virginia, coal-producing state. He's up for re-election in 2018. What position does it put those Democrats and Republicans who disagreed with the decision to withdraw?
I think it depends on where they live, Victor. If you're Susan Collins in Maine, you can criticize Trump on this. If you're Manchin, or if you're from Pennsylvania, you're going to say, you know, this is a flawed treaty, and there is a case to be made, as we discussed in the last half hour, that this treaty is full of loopholes, it's unenforceable, it doesn't really do a lot to reduce climate change. So I think there's an argument to be made by the Manchins of the world who have to worry about getting reelected.
It's interesting, there was a conservative think tank, you know, they were told ahead of time that this was going to happen, and one of the insiders at one of those think tanks said, you know, when you're struggling, you have to go back to your base. This is not about what the world thinks about us. This is not what about the green elites, as the Wall Street Journal puts it, thinks about it. This is about what those workers in heavy industry think.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about all the studies. One of my favorite sayings is, there's lies, there's damn lies, and there are statistics.
Mark Twain.
You can prove any case you want with any set of statistics. The fact is that this country, I think, is seeking to disengage from the rest of the world. All the hand-wringing this morning that we're going to lose our stature, I think this administration and Steve Bannon do not want the U.S. to be the policeman, to be the nation builder. I think we're consciously withdrawing.
Despite the ridicule and the deriding from Elon Musk and Jeff Immelt and Bob Iger and their withdrawal from the council, is this a driver insofar that looking ahead to 2018, that this alone, climate change and the withdrawal from this, will be enough to motivate voters at the polls?
You got to think young people, people who are environmentalists, will vote in larger numbers both in 2018 and 2020. It's an issue down the road, but I think in the short run, again, I think it solidifies Trump's base, which he needs to do to get through the Comey testimony.
You know what's so interesting to me is the president said he's speaking for Pittsburgh, not Paris. And that really struck me because Pittsburgh is seen as this great diversified town that recovered from a disaster, you know, a cratering of the steel industry, and is now, you know, a hub of autonomous car driving, you know, car technology and tech and startups and diverse niche manufacturing. Isn't that interesting? I mean, Pittsburgh is actually the example of the post-carbon economy, but the president doesn't seem to know that.
You know, I'm in Pittsburgh a lot. It's a fabulous, dynamic city. The Pittsburgh that he talked about yesterday is the Pittsburgh of 50 years ago. It doesn't exist anymore.
And the tweet we just saw was from Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto, and let's put it back up. Fact, Hillary Clinton received 80% of the vote in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh stands with the world and will follow the Paris Agreement. We've heard that from mayors across the country, as I listed off a few of the CEOs. To what degree can these goals, these efforts still be accomplished, considering the withdrawal from the Paris Accord by the U.S.?
Well, I think most of the countries who signed will comply. I think a lot of cities around America, a lot of states, a lot of companies will comply. So there still will be some progress. But I think for this administration right now, 270 is the statistic that matters the most. That's what you need to win the Electoral College. And to put that map together, he has to make speeches like this.
All right. Greg Valliere, thank you so much.
Have a great weekend, Greg.
You too. Yep.
The Trump administration now petitioning the Supreme Court to reinstate the president's dress fabric.
Duly noted. Let's get a check on CNN Money Stream this Friday morning. Global stock markets and futures stretching higher after record highs. The Dow popping 136 points for its first record close since March 1st. Overall, a banner day on Wall Street. Stocks shrugging off the business community's protest of that Paris deal decision because corporate America has already made plans for climate change, these CEOs tell us, and they're not changing course now. And investors also saw a strong reading of private sector jobs ahead of today's official monthly jobs report. That report should show an 80th consecutive month of jobs growth. The May jobs report due in 2.5 hours. 179,000 jobs added is the forecast, and the jobless rate at the 10-year low of 4.4%. Now, the president promises 25 million jobs over the next 10 years. He says he's well on his way.
More than 1 million Private sector jobs.
Okay, we're keeping track. 1 million private sector jobs he said he's created. The Labor Department counts 522,000 jobs since he took office. Where did he come up with twice that? Likely the ADP jobs report. It's a private sector, private sector tally, and it shows 1.2 million jobs since January. Two problems with that figure. ADP is just an estimate, and it uses a much smaller sample than the Labor Department. Also, he's counting all of the jobs in January, of course. January 20th was when he came into office. All right, U.S. auto sales fell for the 5th straight month. The big U.S. auto companies sold just over 1.5 million cars in May, down from last year. Car sales are slowing after 7 years of increases, and automakers are trimming production and jobs now to save money. For example, GM has cut about 5,000 jobs since November. And of course, the president often talks about American automakers adding production and how important this is as a manufacturing base in this country. After 7 years, maybe you're starting to see those sales peak. We'll closely watch that.
All right.
All right. By the way, the Spelling Bee winner, Ananya Vinay, will be on New Day just before 8 a.m. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christine Romans.
I'm Victor Blackwell. Good to be here.
Nice to see you.
New Day starts right now.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Our president is choosing to put American jobs and American consumers first.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
Couldn't have picked a worse city as an example.
The message to the rest of the world is that the United States is abdicating leadership.
France will not give up the fight.
Fired FBI Director James Comey to testify.
It probably will be the most explosive and most watched hearing since Watergate.
Putin likens hackers to artists.
Perhaps he sees the trail of evidence is getting closer to the Kremlin.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. It's Friday, June 2nd, 6 o'clock here in New York, and we begin with several major developments on the starting line. The Trump administration appealing to the Supreme Court to reinstate its halted travel ban on people from 6 majority Muslim countries. And leaders around the world expressing their disappointment over President Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, while cities and states in the U.S. vow to abide by the agreement, showing their support for the accord by lighting up buildings in green.
White House officials are refusing to say whether President Trump believes climate change is a hoax. They literally won't answer the question. Does the president believe human activity contributes to global warming? It matters. They should answer. And what can only be described as must-see TV. Former FBI Director James Comey will testify before a Senate panel next Thursday. The big question is, what will he reveal about private conversations with President Trump? We have it all covered. Let's get to CNN's Joe Johns live at the White House. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Chris. On the Paris Accord, the president willing to accept the condemnation of the world in order to keep a promise he made to his loyal supporters during the campaign. A promise that was easy to keep because it didn't have to be vetted by any other branch of the U.S. government. But the fallout in terms of U.S. standing in the world could be enormous.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
President Trump making good on his campaign promise to withdraw from the landmark 195-nation agreement, but leaving the door open for a potential new deal.
We're getting out, but we will start to negotiate, and we will see if we can make a deal that's fair. And if we can, that's great.
Trump's Rose Garden speech focusing not on climate change, but Trump claiming instead the accord is hurting American jobs.
The Paris Agreement handicaps the United States economy in order to win praise from the very foreign capitals and global activists that have long sought to gain wealth at our country's expense.
Touting the decision puts America first.
Our withdrawal from the agreement represents a reassertion of America's sovereignty. We don't want other leaders and other countries laughing at us anymore, and they won't be.
Sources tell CNN the president was dead set on this decision, with the nationalist wing of his administration prevailing, while his daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner, who were absent from the announcement, pushed for him to stay in the deal, along with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
As someone who cares deeply about the environment, which I do, I cannot in good conscience support a deal that punishes the United States. I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
The mayor of Pittsburgh hitting back after Trump invoked the name of his city.
And the values that we have in this city follow right along the lines of what the Paris Agreement stated.
After the announcement, White House officials struggling on whether the president still believes climate change is a hoax.
You're going to actually have to ask him.
Former President Obama, who signed the agreement, responding in a rare statement, saying the deal was meant to protect the world we leave to our children, adding the nations that remain will reap the benefits in jobs and industries created.
Donald Trump is not telling the truth to the American people when he says we have this huge burden that's been imposed on us by other nations. It's voluntary, and the President of the United States could have simply changed that without walking away from the whole agreement.
Backlash also growing among American business leaders who fiercely lobbied President Trump to stay in the deal. Tesla and SpaceX CEO Elon Musk and Disney's Bob Iger quitting the president's economic council. General Electric CEO Jeff Immelt tweeting, "Industry must now lead and not depend on government." Cities and states are also vowing to step up. Dozens of governors and mayors across the country collectively pledging to uphold the commitments of the Paris Agreement.
Today, the White House press secretary is expected to give one of his increasingly rare on-camera briefings and is expected to be accompanied by one of the men of the hour, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, who was also a supporter of the president's move on the Paris Accords. Allison, back to you.
Okay, Joe, thanks so much for that. So world leaders are slamming President Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. In a joint statement, France, Italy, and Germany make it clear that there's no interest in renegotiating. CNN's Clarissa Ward is live in London with more. What's the reaction, Clarissa?
Well, Allison, I think by the time President Trump actually made this announcement, a lot of world leaders had already accepted or come to the grim realization that President Trump was choosing to join the ranks of President Bashar al-Assad and Daniel Ortega. But nonetheless, we have seen reaction falling in from across the globe. Disappointing, but not at all surprising. That was from the Australian Prime Minister, Canadian Prime Minister calling it very disappointing. British Prime Minister Theresa May, when she spoke to President Trump on the phone, also expressed her disappointment. You're sensing a recurring theme here. You mentioned that joint statement from Italy, Germany, and France. They talked about how much they regretted President Trump's decision, and they also made it clear, as you alluded to, that there will not be any renegotiation of the Paris Climate Accord, as President Trump had indicated might be a possibility. They drew a line under that, saying there is no reversal of Paris. And newly elected French President Emmanuel Macron even had a kind of creative riff on one of Donald Trump's favorite slogans. Take a listen.
We all share the same responsibility. Make our planet great again.
And finally, Der Spiegel, which is a German weekly news magazine, also did a riff on another one of Donald Trump's favorite slogans. If we can pull up the cover for you now, it says, "America first, Earth last." Allison and Chris.
That's a dramatic cover. All right, Clarissa, thank you very much. Stay with us if you would, because we want to bring in the rest of our panel right now. We have CNN political commentator Errol Lewis with us and CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. David, I want to start with you. You have a piece in the New York Times this morning in which you say that President Trump has just given China a great gift. What do you mean?
Well, the Chinese have been looking for ways to step into the void that it believes that President Trump has been leaving around the world. So a few months ago, the president pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was an Asian trade deal that actually excluded China and was supposed to organize the world around the United States and, just to the minds of some, to contain the Chinese. China's exploited that. Now, with the decision to pull out of the climate accord, the Paris Accord, the Chinese see another opportunity because The accord, as you may recall, was based on a negotiation between President Obama and President Xi Jinping in 2014 that formed the basis of what all the other nations signed on to. So the Chinese are now saying they will be the leader in the environment. Now there's some rich irony here. The Chinese are not free traders. They emit now twice as much CO2 as the United States does. And yet, the Chinese are able to go use this moment to say that they will be in the forefront of reducing carbon emissions while the U.S. is on the sidelines. That's really not the place, I think, that many wanted the United States to be.
Interesting, Errol. This really is not a surprise. Let's be honest. We're treating it as a big event. The president hyped it as a big event, but he was always going to do this. The question is why it makes so much sense for him. We get what the international reaction is. We realize how absurd it is that the White House won't even address what the president thinks is causing global warming. But why did he do this?
My sense of it is that politically he is going to go to show his supporters that he'll fight till the last dog dies, as the expression goes. That the more he gets criticized for sticking by coal miners and industrial workers that he says will benefit from this, whether or not that actually happens is a separate question, but the more he does that, the more they love him. And, you know, and he can turn around, and I expect to see this on the campaign trail and at rallies for him to say, I did this for you. I don't care what anybody thinks anywhere in the world. I'll stand alone against literally the entire world to look out for your interest. That is political gold as far as sort of binding him to his political base. Now, is that base big enough? Can he grow it? Is it worth it? That we're going to all find out over the next few years.
Larissa, one of the curious things, curious arguments of logic that the president made was, we're going to renegotiate. We don't like these terms, though the terms were quite flexible. I mean, each country sort of decides...
It's not even a binding agreement.
It's not a binding agreement, and each country decides what they want to do in terms of environmental progress. But it sounds like this morning that other countries, Germany, France, say they have no interest in any sort of renegotiating.
I think everyone's sort of scratching their heads a bit about the idea of renegotiating this deal because, as you just made the point, it's not legally binding, and President Trump has already been seeking to undermine some of the initiatives that President Obama had put in place to achieve better clean energy objectives. So the Europeans have come out very strongly and said, forget about it. There can't be a renegotiation because, by the way, almost every country in the world, with the exception of Syria, Nicaragua, and now the U.S., this is the trio that the U.S. is now a part of, has accepted this goal. Now, whether that be China or India, the most notorious polluters, Russia, all of them have managed to come to some kind of a consensus. So the deal will not be rewritten just because the U.S. has decided it does not want to enter it. But I think more broadly, what this speaks to is a kind of crisis of global leadership, where Europe particularly is understanding that this alliance that has been a treasured alliance for many decades, whereby the U.S. is the de facto leader of the free world, that alliance is shifting. It is changing, and now Europe and other countries across the globe need to look to different places for leadership. And that is quite a sobering awakening.
So you had Pruitt, the EPA administrator, say America doesn't have to defend its stewardship of the environment, which was an interesting choice of words, David Sanger, when they were de facto abdicating that stewardship by pulling out of the accord. And you had this big corporate reaction. You can put up the list of labels and logos, a lot of them energy companies coming out and saying this is a mistake. So David, tell us why, and also explain to us this really awkward silence and reluctance from White House officials to address whether or not the president even believes in global warming.
Well, Chris, you had three remarkable things here. First, the business community is supposed to be Donald Trump's biggest supporter, and here you see companies that probably cheered when he came in with his regulatory agenda, or deregulatory agenda, I should say, and they're on the other side of this. Why is that? Because they recognize that whatever costs and burdens this imposes, over the long term, it's where the world's going, and they want to be the standard setters, as Clarissa suggested, rather than have to go deal with standards set by others around the world. The second remarkable thing is the president's had 3 years now since he declared his candidacy, or 2.5 years, I should say, to basically come to a conclusion about whether he believes climate change is real. So he's made it clearer in his Twitter feed than his spokesman did. The third point, which I think gets to this issue of whether or not there was another option for him, is that there are other things he could have done that wouldn't have looked as dramatic, but might have had the same or even more effect. He could have, as Clarissa suggested, simply said, we're not going to abide by some of the targets that President Obama set because they're voluntary. He could have come out and said, you know, this is more like a treaty than an executive agreement, so I'm going to turn it over to the Senate, where, of course, it would languish for years, like the Comprehensive Trade Test Ban Treaty in the nuclear world. He didn't do that. Under that condition, the Senate could have debated it while the U.S. decided how much they would abide by its regulations.
So, Errol, let's talk about the White House's logic and the White House's side here. They say it's about jobs. And the president says that he was elected to protect American jobs. And in fact, there's this economic research group that says that the agreement would have cost the U.S. 2.7 million jobs over the course of, I guess, the next 8 years. That's the high end. But even the low end is 2.3 million jobs. So doesn't the president have, isn't that what he's hanging his hat on in his logic here?
Well, it's an argument. It's not conclusively proved by any means. And of course, you know, there's the countervailing argument, which is that there are far, far, far more jobs to be had. More jobs now, more jobs in the future when it comes to the renewable industries.
But would those have made up that gap? So if you're going to lose 2.7, let's go with his number, million jobs, would clean energy jobs have been able to make up that gap, people think?
It is conceivable. It is by no means, you know, out of the question. The numbers are very shaky because how you count something as a green job gets to be very, very dicey. There's also a question on the fossil fuel side. Are you including all of the gas stations? Are you including the gas station attendants? Are they part of that whole complex? But any way you look at it, clearly the future is in the direction. Look, when you see China say, we're going to create 13 million jobs in the clean energy sector in the next few years, clearly they think that there's something there. So the president is making a bet on what some say are already highly automated jobs in a declining sector.
That's a big point. That's a key deception here, okay? Will the green jobs fill the gap? In all likelihood, no, not at this point. There are even legitimate questions about whether or not our power grid, our infrastructure could handle the amount of new energy they're talking about, clean energy. But the deception is, well, you know, this accord, this is what's killing your jobs, coal miners. That's not true. We've been losing those jobs since before the EPA was even put in 1970. Automation is a big deal for it. Emerging markets around the world is a big reason for it. It is all about whether or not the president can restore those jobs. It was an easy promise to make, but can he deliver? That's what the voters are going to decide on, and it ties into what the greenhouse gases are supposed to be about. They won't even answer the question. You know, the point that they were making, Gary Cohn made it very well, but it was in response to the question about whether or not he believes in climate change.
Right.
So,
and, you know, obviously he's tweeted before that it's a hoax, so we will obviously ask the president's people that today.
And he asked for remediation from global warming damage for one of his golf courses, so he's had it both ways. But listen to this mashup of, you know, Wolf Blitzer asking Gary Cohn 4 different times, does the president believe in it? And every time he says he believes in jobs. Listen to this.
Does the president believe climate change is a hoax?
This is not about whether climate change is occurring or not.
Does President Trump still believe climate change is a hoax?
What President Trump believes is he was elected to grow the U.S. economy.
But with all due respect, Gary, you're not answering the question.
I'm answering what the president is committed to. You're going to have to ask him. You're going to actually have to ask him.
Can you say whether or not the president believes that human activity is contributing to the warming of the climate?
Honestly, I haven't asked him.
Okay.
And get back to you.
You haven't asked him whether or not he believes in climate change. You'll have to ask him directly. I mean, isn't that what a White House spokesperson is all about? Isn't that what an official is about? I think it's a pretty big deal. I really do. The reluctance, the awkwardness, ducking an obvious question.
Well, I mean, look, this could end up being something like, birtherism or something where, at the end of many, many years of all of these, playing these games, he says, I don't talk about that anymore. Or, let's be clear, climate change is real. What do you get? I mean, what really matters, and just as we've said, just as Secretary Kerry was saying in the clip that you played, he never had to sort of take this dramatic action of denouncing this. He could have dialed back all of the standards. He could have sat on some.
Could have cut the money for other economies.
He could have, if he was serious about renegotiating, he could have said, let's find a new standard, that we're doing this the wrong way. He chose to do none of those things.
He could have just said, I don't want to pay for you to find ways to be greener. Find your own way.
Yeah, panel. Thank you. We will obviously be talking about it through the rest of the program.
All right, we're following breaking news this morning on another front. The high-stakes battle over President Trump's halted travel ban is going to head to the highest court in the land. Will the Supreme Court give the president the win against Muslim immigration he so desperately wants? CNN's Laura Jarrett live in Washington with more. The handicapping will begin.
Exactly, Chris. Well, the Trump administration really escalated its legal fight over that travel ban late last night, filing hundreds of pages with the U.S. Supreme Court, all in the hopes of convincing the justices to allow the ban to go into effect. You'll remember late last week, a lower court, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, ruled against Trump, using his own words to find that the travel ban likely violates the Constitution because it was allegedly motivated by an intent to disfavor Muslims. But the Justice Department has now appealed that decision, saying in a statement last night that it's, quote, confident that the President Trump's executive order is well within his lawful authority to keep our nation safe and to protect our communities from terrorism. Now, no telling on how fast the Supreme Court will act on all these moving pieces here, but in the short term, the Trump administration
line of questioning from senators about the tense confrontations and private conversations with President Trump that sources have told us Comey recorded in memos, like the claims that Trump urged Comey to go easy on now former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Now, if he can't answer publicly, the commission does have a closed session with Comey afterward to ask some more questions. Now, speaking of the election meddling, perhaps it was rooted in patriotism. Rogue Russian patriotism, that is. That's what Russian President Vladimir Putin hypothesized on Thursday when, really for the first time, he appeared to concede that the hacking attempts may have come from his country, saying, quote, hackers are free people, just like artists. They would wake up, read about something going on in interstate relations, and if they feel patriotic, they may try to contribute to the fight against those who speak badly about Russia. Now, Allison, we have to point out that Putin did insist the government didn't put anybody up to this, if it did in fact happen, and continued, as the Kremlin has, to deny that they had anything to do with the U.S. election. But quite remarks there from Putin.
Absolutely, Diane. Thank you very much for all that reporting.
The irony that even with that sarcasm, Putin wound up going further than the President of the United States in terms of admitting Russian involvement in the interference.
Great point.
So let's bring in the rest of our panel. Errol Lewis and David Sanger, and joining us, Associate Editor and columnist for Real Clear Politics, A.B. Stoddard. So what do we make of the Comey testimony? There's a lot of hype around it, so let me be a human bucket of cold water. What can actually come out that would change the fate of the president or anyone around him?
Well, look, it can certainly sort of galvanize the attention on this. So there's probably some number of Americans out there who don't think this is very serious. This is going to be serious, and the coverage of it is going to be serious. As you know, also, this is not going to be a court of law, right? Every misleading, leading question in the world can and will be thrown at James Comey to try and get him to sort of emote, but also to try and raise some of those possibilities and the suspicions that a lot of the senators have, especially the Democrats, about what could have happened and how far it went. I think the bucket of cold water that you're throwing on this is a point well taken, because this is somebody who is very careful, who is very measured, who doesn't say more than he can. And the fact that he had to sort of sit down with Mueller and try and figure out what would and wouldn't be able to get disclosed.
Well, he didn't have to. He wanted to. Well, right? Mueller doesn't control who goes before Congress.
This is also somebody who's spent a lifetime, sort of not talking, right? Sort of being very careful about what he says. So I don't think it's going to be the big display and the big show that some might be hoping for. On the other hand, you know, there are things that get shaken loose, and you hate to go back to Watergate, and I don't say this for political reasons, but the reality was, you know, it was in the course of a congressional hearing that somebody, quite by accident, mentioned, oh yeah, there's a taping system in the Oval Office. You don't know what you're going to hear, and that's partly why I think it's important to do this all out in the open.
It will be fascinating that it's out in the open. I mean, just as we've said, must-see TV. But David Sanger, I want to go back to Putin for a second, because when he says this might have just been patriotic citizens who hacked the U.S. Or attempted to election, you know, it's been, the point has been made lately that because of all of this attention on Putin, the unfortunate byproduct of this is turning him into this sort of global boogeyman who is able to control U.S. democracy. And it's funny that Putin is downplaying that role, but of course we can't really trust what he's saying.
You sure can, Allison, but you know, we spend a lot of time here talking about the White House changing its story. Mr. Putin has changed his story here big time. Initially, last year, he was saying, you have no evidence this came from Russia. How could this be? You can't tell. Cyber attacks can come from any place. Essentially the same line that President Trump was taking during the campaign and the transition. Now he says, well, maybe you're right. Maybe it did come from Russia, but it wasn't government controlled. And that's one of the key elements of cyber attacks, because many countries, China and Russia leaders in this, have armies of people whose links to the government are always a little bit murky. It's never entirely clear whether they're acting on their own, whether they're freelancing, or whether they were told what to do with the material. And then once they got the material, were they in control of it, or did it go to the hands of the GRU, the Russian military intelligence operation, which is what U.S. intelligence believes? But Putin's made a very big move here from wasn't us to, well, maybe, but you know, teenagers these days, what can you do with them?
And remember, we had James Clapper on the show just a few days ago, and he said this was unprecedented, and the evidence was overwhelming that this leads back to Russia, this interference. AB.
That's because they picked up intercepts of Russian officials talking about the material.
Right. When you brag about it, very often that gets you in trouble. AB, this legal case going to the Supreme Court, how big a deal is it? How big a win for the president would it be if the ban is upheld by the Supreme Court?
I think that it would be an enormous victory for the president, because he's fought hard through appeals, and this is a signature issue. Obviously, it's one of the sort of first policy pronouncements out of the gate that wasn't just an executive order that was going to go nowhere and not be legally binding. And he ran on this, and he's struggled since with his legal team to say that this is not something that just favors Muslims and it's not a Muslim ban. But he says it's a major component of his national security to stop the bad dudes from coming into the country and threatening us here. And so I think if he was able to get a win in the Supreme Court, it would be next to the confirmation of Neil Gorsuch, the biggest win he's had.
Okay, panel, thank you very much for all of that. We have to get back to one of our other top stories. President Trump pulling out of the Paris climate deal to keep a campaign promise time during the election, traversing the country, talking to voters. What's your sense of what his base feels about this?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about the people who are at the very, very core of his base, there is definitely a sense that, American workers and American people are getting the raw end of the deal. And I think that's why we heard Trump, as he was going out throughout the country, saying things like these trade deals, these agreements are not good for our country. But I also think that having spent a lot of time at Trump rallies, there's also a segment of the Republican base that doesn't actually believe, or didn't believe at the time, that Trump was going to follow through on some of these campaign promises. Talking to voters, there was always this sort of sentiment, look, Trump is saying what he needs to say right now to get him through the election, to win the election, but we don't actually believe that he's going to build a wall.
So now that he is following through on this, are they happy about that?
Well, I think some of Trump's critics and some, strategists who are watching him make these policy decisions would say this might be a miscalculation, that what he's doing now is solidifying the people who are at the very core of his base, but not necessarily broadening his support to independents and even Democrats that he might need to win over in some of these places in the Rust Belt. And I think especially for a president whose approval numbers are so low right now, so early in his presidency, that might be a miscalculation. That's what some strategists might say.
So a little bit of it comes down to who is they, who you're talking about specifically. So JD, this does seem to be a pretty straight line bargain with people who are in those beat up towns and communities where you had a deep manufacturing base, and specifically the coal industry. So if that's what this was, how much of this is a promise that Donald Trump's going to make their life better, he's going to return those jobs? How big a part of the promise is that, the delivery on something different, not just getting out of an accord?
Well, that's certainly the promise that he made, and if you look at his remarks yesterday when we pulled out of the Paris Accord, what President Trump said is, look, this is a trade-off between a global agreement and American jobs. Unfortunately for the president, I think both the political benefits and good for the president, the political costs of pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords is actually pretty minimal, because if you look not just at his core base, but if you look at voters in general, most voters just don't care that much about climate policy. And so I think that the president is doing something that he may see as an act of political theater, that may bring some real political benefits to him. But I just don't see the evidence in that, either in talking to people or in just looking at the data and how people prioritize climate policy.
Right, except that the numbers show that Republicans and Americans overall thought that we should stay in the accord. So it wasn't like he was doing something that was very popular. It seems to be a trade on this notion, which I would suggest is disinformation. I don't believe that this accord is why we're losing coal jobs or will continue to lose coal jobs. I think there's a lot of other factors, but what if he doesn't return those jobs? What if those people in those areas aren't given new employment and better wages?
Well, Chris, you made a really important point, which is that the majority of the public does support the deal, but the strength of that support is actually pretty weak, so it's not a high priority issue, and consequently I think the politics are pretty ambivalent here for the president. But the most important point is exactly the one that you made just there, which is that you've got to actually bring jobs back to these communities, and that implicates productivity, that implicates our education system. It frankly implicates issues that are much more difficult and much more complex than just pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. And so I think while the president may get a short-term, very minor political advantage with his core base of supporters, at a fundamental level over the long term, people are going to be looking around and saying, is my life actually getting better? Are these things actually improving? And unfortunately, I don't think pulling out of the Paris Accords does much good, and I don't think that much of what we've seen so far in the first 120 days does much good. This is a really long-term question that the president has to answer better.
JD, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, these are your people, right? Hillbilly Elegy was based on your relatives, and you know the coal mining industry, and they, of course, know more about the coal mining industry than the president does. Do they believe that their coal jobs are coming back?
Well, that's what's so amazing about this entire conversation, is that the people on the ground are in some ways the most pessimistic of all about whether those coal jobs are coming back. Look, you definitely talk to people who think that maybe the coal industry could get a little bit better over the short and medium term, but people generally recognize that the coal economy is a small part of the economy and that it's never returning to its former glory. And so folks recognize that there has to be a new economic leaf in the area. We need something else. We need newer kinds of jobs. We need the education that prepares people to actually work in those jobs. And that's why I think that ultimately what we're seeing with the Paris Accords politically isn't going to affect the president that much one way or the other. If he loses his base, it will be because 2 years from now they say jobs haven't come back. And I think that's really the fundamental question the president and his team have to be asking.
So MJ, so how do you deal with that in terms of the challenge for the president, as you articulated and JD supports? He's got to grow. Sure, he may have pleased some of his base with doing this because he promised to, but how does he grow?
Well,
see on that?
First of all, I would just quickly emphasize that it was not a coincidence yesterday that the majority of Trump's speech yesterday had to do with an economic message, that because of this climate deal, we have seen jobs leaving the country, that it is, the workers who are in the Rust Belt states, he specifically mentioned certain places like Pittsburgh that are losing, that, I want to be the leader of these kinds of towns and cities. I'm not the leader of Paris. However, I think the message that also